Google plans on passing the cost of the Liberal government's new digital services tax to advertisers by way of a 2.5% surcharge for ads displayed in Canada. A Google spokesperson says digital service taxes increase the cost of digital advertising, so the surcharge is to cover part of the costs associated with complying with the tax. A spokeswoman for Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says the Canadian government had made it clear for several years it would move forward with its own digital service tax if a global agreement on it was not reached. Some critics of the bill long argued that this is exactly what would happen. And joining us now is one of those critics, Jay Goldberg from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Jay, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Now, can you walk us through how exactly this new fee is going to be applied and what it means for advertising in Canada?
So the Liberal government passed a bill earlier this year that allows for a digital services tax here in Canada. And what that does is apply a 3% tax to all revenue above $20 million that big tech giants earn in Canada. But we're talking about tech giants ranging from Uber to Amazon to Apple. And so they're having this 3% tax on revenue they're making here in Canada. And what that could mean for consumers, of course, is that that 3% tax could be passed along. So the fact that Google is now applying a 2.5% surcharge to their advertising fees here in Canada, that could just be the tip of the iceberg. We could be looking at companies like Uber, like Amazon, like Apple, deciding to pass these costs on to consumers, because we know that companies don't just eat the cost of new taxes, they pass those on. One other concerning thing is that this tax is retroactive to 2022, which is why so many of these companies are going to be really scrambling as they try to figure their way out in the months ahead.
Now, you warned about this long ago when the tax was first proposed. Were your concerns taken seriously by those in Ottawa?
No, I think the government repeatedly said that, that these corporations would pay the tax, it wouldn't be passed on to consumers. We all know there is no tax on companies that is not passed along to consumers. Anytime you raise costs for companies, they simply pass that on to the consumer. That's just the way it works. And I think probably a lot of people in Ottawa were telling the government that. They simply chose not to listen. The finance minister mentioned that the government had been in negotiations with other governments about some sort of global agreement, but that hasn't come to pass. And another very concerning thing is that in the past, when we've imposed these kinds of taxes, and they're really hitting American companies in particular, the Americans haven't been afraid to hit back. And so we could be looking at things like tariffs from the United States, especially post-presidential election. As we get into next year, if this tax, comes into force, the Americans are going to look to respond. So the government really didn't heed the warnings, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, because we could be looking at a U.S. government response, not just a response from the companies in terms of imposing higher taxes.
Now, the tax is being framed as making big companies pay their fair share. What do you make of that claim?
Well, I mean, all of these companies already pay corporate taxes in Canada, so it's disingenuous to suggest that that's just not the case. And so this is just an extra tax. This is almost a second tax on all of these companies, and so it's really singling them out in particular. And so there's 2 points to really hammer home. Is number one, of course, any tax on corporations is always passed on to the consumers. We know that. But number two is the fallout that could happen in our relationship with the United States, the tariffs and the fees that could be imposed on the American side of the border. Because again, all of these giants, the Amazons, the Apples, the Ubers, they're all based in the United States. And the US Trade Representative has consistently said that they feel this tax is singling out the United States and American corporations, because practically all of these corporations are based in the United States. So the government is raising costs on Canadians and angering our number one trading partner at the very same time.
And do you think that other tech giants could follow Google's lead and pass on the costs of that tax to consumers? Like, what else could be impacted here?
That's what I worry about. You could be looking at more expensive trips in Ubers. You could be looking at a higher Apple Music bill. You could be looking at all kinds of things This is just the first company, Google, to do it. Again, it's the tip of the iceberg. The tax is going to come into force at the beginning of next year. And so I think you're going to see in the next few months companies scrambling to respond to this because they're not just going to take this lying down.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. Don't go anywhere. Forum Daily will be right back.